Thanks for joining us.
Talkline Network Radio, America's longest-running Jewish broadcast network, the voice of the Jewish community.
Welcome to the podcast. You are now tuned in to this episode of our podcast. Today, we are going to interview some of the greatest and most influential minds in our field. And now, please welcome your host.
You're listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
And we're back. You know, there are a lot of interesting stories related to the Holocaust, to the Shoah, about people writing about their parents' experiences. Some of the parents themselves have written memoirs, but not always do things seem as they appear. Our guest is Karen Frenkel. She's an award-winning technology and science journalist, author, documentary producer. She wrote a book with Isaac Asimov, Robust Machines in Man's Image. She also has been written for Scientific American, New York Times, Village Voice, U.S. News, World Reports, other publications. She's a documentary maker as well, including some items on the Holocaust. But her new book is called Family Treasures, Lost and Found, Unraveling My Family's Secret Riveting Stories of the Holocaust. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So I myself have a mother who was a Holocaust survivor, and I grew up with stories of the Holocaust. But not every Holocaust survivor spoke about their past. Your mother was a slave laborer and went through horrible things. Your father was a doctor, Dr. David Frenkel, but from what I understand, he didn't really talk at all about what he experienced during the war, correct?
Yes, that's correct. My father was a refugee who got out of Poland in March of 1939, several months before the Germans invaded Poland. And all I knew growing up was that he had somehow gotten to Mexico and from there came to the United States, but I didn't really know when. And but I did know not to ask him about his life before the war and during the war, because my mother said not to talk to my father, to be very gentle with my father during springtime, because that was when his mother took the poison. And I don't know how.
His mother took cyanide pills because the Nazis were coming.
Yes. And so I had asked why, and she explained what you just said. And however, I did once ask, and my father left the room, and I followed him, and I apologized profusely. And then I gingerly asked again, and he said he didn't want to talk about it. And so I never again approached him about his past. It was too painful for him.
Did he speak about his first wife, who was the daughter of the owner of Ratner's and also involved with the Jewish mafia, Jewish underworld?
No, he told us nothing. The only reason why I found out about that and pursued it in my documentary and in the memoir is because a year after my father died, he died quite young. He was 57 and I was 15. So I never got a chance to approach him again, adult to adult, about all of this. But my sisters and I were going through his papers a year after he died, and suddenly my sister waved an envelope and said to my mother, who was off in the kitchen, we were in our father's office, "Mom, who is Rose Frenkel?" And there was silence, and my mother then finally said, "Oh, your father was married before he met me," trying to sound nonchalant. And she added that my father and Rose divorced because he found out shortly after he arrived here that she had a lover who was married and a gangster.
Wow.
So
that could be a whole story unto itself. You can make a whole book about that.
Well, I spent a great deal of time researching her to try and understand the motivations on both sides. Was it a marriage of mutual benefit? Why did she apparently travel to Poland sometime in the late fall of 1938 and early 39 to Lvov, of all places, which is now Lviv, Ukraine? And I also, my mother had saved my father's documents, so I found their marriage certificate. So I knew the date, which was February 1939.
How did he meet her? If he was in Poland, she was in the United States. How did they meet?
He was apparently a tourist. And so the question was, who visits Lvov in 1938, 1939? I mean, there was an awareness that it was not a very good time to go there. And I also found out that Rose had a cousin who married the best man at their wedding, who was my father's cousin. So two Jewish women from New York married two cousins in Lvov. And I began to think that this was an attempt to rescue Jewish men, perhaps. We know that there were ads in newspapers to try and save Jewish men and women as well, but especially Jewish men. And perhaps that was part of the reason why they traveled.
But if they get married around 1939, I would assume. So did she go back to New York? But your father didn't go to New York in 1939, did he?
No.
No, he didn't. So, but she went back to New York, correct?
Well, he didn't go directly to New York. I found out through ship manifests that she sailed from Le Havre on an elegant luxury liner in April of 39. And my mother saved my father's passport, his Polish passport. So I had I had a sense of his itinerary because of the visas that were stamped on various pages of the passport. And I wanted to find out how he got to the Western Hemisphere. And I knew that there was a slight, not quite legible stamp on the passport that indicated that he had sailed from someplace in mid-May of 1939. And I remembered that the St. Louis crisis had occurred around that time. So I went to a site in the Holocaust Museum encyclopedia, and I looked up the St. Louis to review it. And they said that there were two other ships in the harbor in Havana at the time of the St. Louis crisis, and one of them was French, and it was called Flandre. So I went back to the passport, to that page, and it turned out that someone had written Flandre in blue ink. And it was not my father's handwriting, but someone, had told him that ship was available to take him. And many of the passengers were actually Spaniards who were escaping they were the ones who were loyalists during the war, the Civil War there. And then I wanted to know what the itinerary was because I knew that my father had gone to Mexico. And to make a long story short, I found out who the owner was of the ship, and I got the itinerary. And in fact, he stopped in Havana as I thought. And then I found a newspaper article by an Austin local newspaper that had sent a reporter down to Havana. And he reported on Rose arguing with an immigration official on the dock, saying, why can't he disembark? All his papers are in order. And the guy said, he can't because he's Jewish. And she said, yes, that was his first crime. He was born a Jew.
So what happened?
So then the boat steamed out looking for ports that would accept Jews, just like St. Louis did and just like the Orduna did. And as luck would have it, in Veracruz, there was an emergency on the dock. And my father was a young doctor, and he saved the life of whoever was ailing on the dock and wrangled his way off the ship and offered to work for free in a hospital until his visa came through with the help of his American wife.
So why didn't your father ever speak about it? Why do you suppose? You did your research, you, of course, undertook, I don't know how long it took you to find all the information, but as a journalist, you had some tools available to you. Why do you suppose your father didn't talk about it?
That part of the story with Havana, well, I was thinking about it. I wrestled with this question for many, many months. And I figure that he didn't tell us about his first wife for several reasons. First, at that time, divorce was a great shanda, and if one didn't have to, one didn't talk about it, you moved on. The second is that Rose's lover was with the underworld, the Jewish underworld in New York, and he may have had to sign some kind of a statement, but certainly if he had spoken about it, a statement or not, it could have endangered us. And so that's my thinking, that, that
What else did you uncover about your father?
One of the most shocking things, actually, besides that, is that when my father was in medical school at the University of Vienna, he was exposed to great persecution and danger. And I had thought that because my father was a refugee and got out before the war, that he did not see that much, as much as my mother or Holocaust survivors who were in the camps, of course, had seen. I thought he had been relatively sheltered. But my mother, in fact, said that my father was the victim of his imagination, because she was in the thick of it and she could absorb what was going on, but my father could only conjecture. And when I started to investigate life on campus in the 1930s, when my father was there, I learned that there were vicious riots in the spring of 1933, but actually they had gone on for about a decade, because the Austro-fascist students would riot and beat up Jews and socialists and communists on their way to one of two anatomy institutes. And the professor was a social democrat and a commissioner of public health in so-called Red Vienna. And there was this clash between that group of what we would call activists now, trying to improve the lives of people by pooling resources, especially after the starvation of children after World War I in Vienna and Austria, and the Austro-fascists who were suspicious of anything that smacked of communism or socialism. And there was a classmate of my father's who wrote a memoir, and I pinpointed an extremely vicious riot in the spring of 1933 that she wrote about, and I contacted the university historians, and they sent me all kinds of information about these riots that the professor, who was Jewish but had converted, the anatomy professor, had called the Reign of Terror. It was so bad.
Our guest is Karen A. Frenkel, the award-winning technology and science journalist, author, documentary producer. Her new book is called Family Treasures, Lost and Found, Unraveling My Family's Secret, Riveting Stories of the Holocaust. She also has a documentary about some of the things that we are talking about. So, but I'm still trying to get a handle. So I just don't understand why your father got so angry or withdrawn whenever you mentioned it. I can understand maybe the fear of the underworld, but it seems irrational. There has to be something more to the story.
Well, there is. I do think he was protecting us because it was dangerous, perhaps, to disclose that he had had that connection through Rose to organized crime. But also, my father had tremendous sadness and pain over the death of his mother, and in particular, the way she died. And that is the only explanation I can come up with. Maybe there was some shame about being a victim of violence at the University of Vienna, but I don't know. All I know is that it haunted me. All of these things haunted me, and I had to find answers, and I tried to fill the gaps, and I filled many of them, but not all of them.
Now, your father eventually came to America. What year did he come to America?
He was in Mexico fulfilling his promise to work for free for half a year. The visa came through in November, and he arrived in late November 1939.
39. And at some point, he divorced this woman. And when was that? He was in the United States Army, I believe, too, correct?
Yes, they separated before he enlisted. He finished his medical training because he needed to. There was some question about getting an internship or something else called an externship, but they were kind of equivalent. And then he got his residency in pathology. And as soon as that was finished, he enlisted in the Army in May 1943.
And when he came back, he got divorced. So he was with this woman a very short period of time. With the woman wrote a very short period of time, from what it sounds like.
According to my uncle, because my father had two brothers and one survived. So according to my uncle, who I knew, um, he never lived with her.
So does your uncle know why your father was so sick? Your uncle must know a lot about what happened to his brother.
Well, they're all gone now. So, when we found out what I just told you, which was in 2001, he we asked, but he didn't want to talk about it, even though I probed. My sister probed.
And there are no other relatives that had any inkling of what your father did.
Well, my grandfather, the sole surviving grandparent, did, but I didn't know him because he died when I was a toddler. And everything I told you, I knew from my uncle and my mother, and then the other things I researched.
Now, one of the fascinating parts of the story is that you have a hidden treasure somewhere buried, right? In Eastern Europe, in Poland.
Yes.
Did you go looking for the hidden treasure?
I did, but half-heartedly.
With a Geiger counter?
I wish I had arranged for that, but I had very low expectations, Zev. Let me start with the discovery of the house. I found through the documents my mother saved of my father's, I found the address of the house that he had grown up in Lvov, now Lviv, Ukraine. And it turned out that I didn't know that Lvov, Lviv has changed hands many times.
Well, the borders kept moving in those days anyway.
Yes, and so it was originally called Lemberg under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then it became Lvov when the Poles took it over, and it became Lemberg again when the Nazis took it over. And before that, for about a year and a half, the Soviets took it over, and it has had various spellings for Lvov, or Lvov as we pronounce it in Polish. But anyway, I had the address, but all the streets had been renamed each time whoever was in power arrived, and I found a map of today's city with Ukrainian names for the streets. So the big challenge was to match the address I had, which was in Polish, to the streets of today. And I managed that, comparing landmarks and parks and kind of zeroing in on what looked like a similar street configuration. And eventually I discovered the house through Google Street View with the Ukrainian address, but the same house number. And there I was sitting at home by myself, looking at this beautiful house with majolica tiles and filigree balconies. And I had been told by my mother that it was special in some way, but she didn't know exactly why. And I tilted up to the Ukrainian sky, this beautiful, crisp sky. And I was alone, and I couldn't tell my sisters, and I couldn't tell my husband. But I kind of strolled virtually down the street. It was a very beautiful, sunny lane. And then I decided to go to the relevant cities as I was filling in the gaps on my quest. So I went both to Krakow and Tarnow, which was important to my mother's story of survival, and Vienna, and also Lviv. And I had a guide who jiggered the lock of this building, which, by the way, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site because it's so remarkable architecturally, designed by Jews, commissioned by Jews, built by Jews. The majolica tiles were fired by Jews as a contribution to humanity, a great achievement.
You should be able to try to retrieve it from the Polish court since it was taken from your family.
Well, there is no remuneration
in Poland, but I know they're working on it, so maybe something.
But it's in Ukraine now.
Ukraine also, I think, they've been talking. I'm Poland more than Ukraine, but it may not hurt to try to find out. I'm sure at some point they may have to give in.
Well, I've considered it, and I have a vague idea of the value of the house. I also have two first cousins, so we can prove that we owned half of the house, and that half would be divided by 5. So we're not all that motivated, and it's not in very good shape, beautiful as it is.
No, but maybe you can find the treasure if you have access to the house. You can do some digging there.
You're right, but I don't know. Maybe I will. maybe I'll try again. But anyway, I did get into the house with the help of the guide. And the other motivation I should tell you is that I found out from my uncle that my grandfather had hid it in the attic of that house. So I very much wanted to get into the attic. And the person who lives on one side of the attic was afraid to let us in. The other person wasn't there. But on the floor below, there was a Ukrainian woman who said that she had moved into the house in the 70s and that old timers told her that it had been a brothel and that there were two passageways from the basement and from the top floor to the cabaret next door, and that there was a red lantern outside, and that she had, when she first moved in, discovered gynecological records of the prostitutes who worked in the cabaret and used the passageway on top, at least, to go to my grandfather's house with their clients, and that the gynecological records were there to vouch for the good health of these women, I guess, so that the Germans and their collaborators would not catch anything. And when she told that detail, I believed everything, because that could have been the only way that my sole surviving grandparent could have escaped when the Nazis would have stormed up the steps.
Our guest for a little while longer, Karen A. Frenkel. The book is called Family Treasures, Lost and Found. Also a documentary about her experiences trying to dig up her father's and mother's Holocaust history. I want to focus for a few minutes on your mother. Tell us about Irene.
My mother was
Goldberger.
Thank you. My mother was a teenager when war broke out. She was 14 and a half and 12 years younger than my father. And she and her parents fled Krakow on the 3rd of September for Eastern Poland, zigzagged across Galicia, and they were in two towns that one of which was taken over shortly after the German invasion, taken over by the Soviets coming from the other direction. And eventually they ended up in Lwów, where my father was from. And in the fall of 1941, the formation of the Lwów ghetto was announced by the Nazis, and my mother was in a state of complete panic and constantly arguing with my grandparents about the best strategies to survive. So her coming of age, her teenage rebellion, was in arguing with them about how to proceed. First, she was trying to convince them, particularly my grandfather, to buy visas for the Dominican Republic, which was accepting Jews. And she found that out from a friend from Krakow she ran into on the street in Lwów. And then the next argument was about whether or not to get false papers. And my grandfather was an attorney, and he was very sort of ethical, and everything had to be strictly legal, and he was reluctant to do that. And I never understood from what she told us, and also from the Fortunoff video archive that she did for Holocaust testimonies on my urging, so I had the benefit of that recording. She never explained exactly why he was so reluctant to get the false papers and borrow money from wealthy relatives we had in New York and in California. So part of what I had to do in the memoir was, imagine what those arguments were like. And I came up with that that he was reluctant because he didn't think that his wife, my grandmother, looked the part. My mother said she looked more Semitic than my mother did, and that he thought that they would be taken advantage of by opportunistic forgers. But in the end, my mother won that argument. But it's just that the papers were not ready when she was forced to separate from her parents by them, because young girls were being kidnapped and thrown into brothels as slave workers, sex slave workers. And so they forced her to leave them, and she went back west to stay with her aunt in a town called Tarnow, fairly near Krakow. And Um, but
So
there's a
where was she
long,
during the? But she did have forged papers, did she not? Which helped her survive, even in the working in a slave labor camp.
the false papers were sent by her parents when she and her aunt, who was a doctor, and her two cousins were forced into the Tarnow ghetto. They were forced later because physicians were not yet being forced into the ghettos when my mother arrived. But they were forced into the ghetto, and my mother, when the papers arrived, made up her mind within 5 minutes to walk out of the ghetto. She was ready to be shot, and somehow she slipped through. And a friend of hers had a farm, possibly paid a farmer who had a hay wagon and delivered hay to the factory in the ghetto. And this guy was the guy who ran the factory. He arranged for that farmer to take my mother away. And he brought her to his farm where there were 5 or 6 siblings and his parents. And one of those siblings was a Polish officer who was himself hiding. And he advised my mother that even with her false papers, she would be found out because she was so dark. And Poles in Western Poland are blonde and blue-eyed. And he convinced her, or she accepted the counterintuitive idea to volunteer to be a slave laborer in Germany because they were so short of workers.
And that's how she survived the war.
Yes.
Fascinating story. Before I let you go, I was just curious, did you ever try tracking down your father's first wife, Rose, or her family or anybody connected to her?
I did, yes. Rose was long gone, as everybody was, when I started this quest in 2014. However, there was a very convoluted, circuitous way that I got to her relatives. I won't go into it here. It's too complicated for that. You have to read the book. But I did end up speaking to Rose's son, who is not my half-brother. And she did eventually marry a gangster who quite likely was the same gangster who was her lover when she married my father, or was married to my father. And he had a very different story from her point of view about what happened.
And what was that story?
That his mother would never have married for any other reason than love, and that it was my father who did not love her and who wanted the divorce.
But let me ask you a question. You said something earlier which intrigued me. You said there was an effort to save Jewish men, especially from Poland and Eastern Europe. What did you mean by that? Did they send people to marry them to try to bring them to this country? What was that all about?
Well, I'll just repeat what I found out. Some of what I said is not necessarily fact. It's what I think is likely. I do know that many Jewish families placed ads in newspapers asking for Jews in a position to save European Jews, not just Polish Jews, and make matches so that they could get out of Europe. And so these were not love matches. They were marriages of convenience, although I don't like that phrase. I think mutual benefit is fairer. And it's possible that that's what happened with my father and Rose, because I found out from the wedding registration that she was staying around the block from my grandparents' house. So it seemed likely that wasn't a coincidence, and that the families may have known one another. And also, as I said, she had a cousin who did the same thing she did. She married.
Was that a common thing, that you had women go to Europe from the United States to marry Jewish men so they can bring them to this country to save them? I'm hearing it for the first time. I'm wondering if this was something which was a pattern. Was there a large group that did this, or this was a very isolated incident? I just seemed surprised that she would go to she or her cousin would go to Poland to marry somebody and bring them back.
Well, let me just add that it's entirely possible that because I knew from her son that her parents disapproved of the company that she kept. So they constantly sent her away on trips. And it's possible that they were trying to break up whatever relationship she was in, and that the way to keep them from hassling her was to find a nice Jewish doctor. And my uncle hinted at that. But as to whether or not it was common to try to save Jewish men this way, I don't know how common it was. I did try to find newspapers that would have had those ads at the time, but it was very difficult to do it. And I had to give up some things, and that's one of the things that I was unable to prove to myself. But I titled the book Family Treasures Lost and Found because while I was able to solve many more mysteries than I expected to, we know that lost and founds, on public transportation, buses, and places where people may leave things, often those items are not reclaimed. And I was not able to reclaim the truth and the history and the memories for everything.
Your documentary where is it being shown?
It's being shown sporadically. We don't yet have distribution. The Sousa Mendes Foundation is going to screen it virtually. People will have access to the film for a few days before a Q&A with myself and the director. And I'm very happy that one of the synagogues in Brooklyn is going to screen it for the Yom HaShoah, and another one in Monterey, California. We post our screenings on the film's website, which is familytreasuresfilm.com, and you can read about the memoir on familytreasuresmemoir.com.
And I want to thank you, Karen A. Frenkel, award-winning technology science journalist, author, documentary producer. Her new book is called Family Treasures, Lost and Found. Thank you for being part of our show. Look forward to having you back.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to
Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast, the pulse beat of the Jewish community.
For continuous Jewish programs, TalklineNetwork.com, or our 24-hour-a-day listen line at 641-741-0389. For past shows, you can find us on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, Instagram, and all major podcast platforms, or jewishpodcast.org. Thanks for listening to the TalklineNetwork.com.
Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Anyway, thank you. I thought it was a very interesting interview, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you again.
Happy